A history of the trial of Castner, Hanway, and others for treason at Philadelphia in November 1851, with an introduction upon the history of the slave question by a member of the Philadelphia Bar. Preface. The following pages contain a short history of the late Christiana Treason Trials. During the progress a phonographic report of all the proceedings was taken and printed, by his order of the court, for the use of the judges and counsel employed in the cause. For this a copyright was secured, and proposals issued for publishing it in full. Though more than 6 months have elapsed, this has not yet been done, and the only account of the transactions to which the public have access is contained in the daily papers of New York and Philadelphia. This pamphlet has been prepared to supply the deficiency. The sources of information used in compiling it have been the phonographic report already referred to, a transcript of the docket of Alderman Reigart of Lancaster, a transcript of the docket of E.D. Ingraham, Esquire, Commissioner of the U.S. Resident in Philadelphia, the records of the Philadelphia County Prison, the records of the Circuit and District Courts, and the files of the Evening Bulletin. Where these have not furnished a connected story, the deficiency has been supplied from the writer's own recollection, or that of his friends, who attended upon or participated in the trial. Some of the most glaring absurdities and incongruities contained in Mr. Brent's pamphlet, which he calls
A Report to His Excellency Governor Low in relation to the Christiana Treason Trials,
have been pointed out. The very limited circulation of this work, confined, we believe, to a few who received copies as a personal favour, would render any notice of it unnecessary, had it not been published in a measure by the authority of the state, whose imaginary wrongs its author has, by these means, sought to vindicate. The almost scurrilous terms in which it denounces the majority of the citizens of Philadelphia, the people of Pennsylvania, the officers of the court in which the trials were held, the judges who presided, and, in short, every one connected with the case, except counsel and the witnesses for the prosecution, are conclusive evidence of more anxiety to omit spleen and mortification than to subserve the purposes of truth and justice. A popular, not a professional view of the subject has been attempted. It is amongst the body of the people that false reports have been spread, and to the people this statement is addressed, in hopes that it may tend to correct the evil. In accordance with the wish of the publishers, a brief introduction has been prefixed, embracing a connected view of all the many attempts which have been made, at various periods, to settle, by congressional legislation, the embarrassing question of slavery. The main object is to show the views entertained upon the subject by the great statesmen who framed the Constitution and watched over its first developments, and accordingly much more space has been devoted to that early legislation than to measures which are still fresh in the recollection of those whom we address. The essay is thought to be appropriate in this connection, because the late great compromise, of which these trials are one of the earliest fruits, is the legitimate consequence of long antecedent measures, and cannot be fully understood or appreciated without bestowing much previous study upon our early political history. The sources from which this introduction has been compiled are strictly original, consisting, as far as possible, of official or semi-official documents and reports. Slavery as a national question. The following brief essay is not intended to be an argumentative discussion of the subject upon which it treats. Discussions of that sort have abounded so much of late years, that there would be much more presumption than wisdom in any attempt to increase the number. But perhaps it may be matter of interest, now that the conflict has been going on for more than 60 years, to know something of its earlier phases, of its varied successes, and of the deeds done and the words spoken by those who fought the same battle long ago in the infancy of the Republic. The region of historical research which we are about to explore appears to be almost a terra incognita to the majority of the fiery debaters who nowadays are prosecuting this wordy war, or if they occasionally plunge into it for a moment, it is only to hurry back in premature triumph, dragging captive some unhappy straggling passage of Jefferson or J. to serve as a bone of contention for a whole generation of self-constituted agitators in and out of Congress. Now, if the object is merely to perpetuate the agitation, the course pursued is unquestionably a wise one, for, short as our national history is, the stock of facts which it supplies us with upon the subject is assuredly large enough, if used with but a tithe of the economy heretofore exhibited, to last till the Union and time itself shall be no more. But there are some quiet spirits still left who get weary of this hopeless strife, and who can scarcely afford to adopt the advice of the Scotch clergyman to wait for rest till they get to heaven, who cannot help calling out,
Peace, peace.
However discordant the answer may be, and who, if they needs must fight, would be glad to know what they're fighting about, fight in earnest and be done with it. To answer, then, at least one of these questions, and suggest to this rapidly increasing class precisely what the present phase of the battle is, and what hopes there are of final peace, this brief historical sketch is attempted. The purpose is not, we repeat it, to discuss the subject. The author aims not at the dignity of a disputant, he is more than satisfied with the humbler task of supplying materials for those who do, in hopes that if rage and anger have hitherto filled the place of armourers in our battlefield, history may in future discharge the duty a little more creditably. It is proposed, then, to trace the slavery question at length, so far as it has been the source of national difficulties, embarrassment and legislation, with especial reference to its earlier history, and to the clause in the Constitution respecting fugitives, which has lately been made the subject of congressional action. It will not be necessary to extend our inquiries to any period anterior to the Revolution, or in any way to examine the peculiar causes which first established and have long perpetuated slavery amongst us. Prior to that event, it was of course a question between Great Britain and her colonies, and nice casuistry might perhaps be needed to determine the relative amount of guilt chargeable on each of the two parties. The moral value, too, of a solemn judicial decision,
that no slave could breathe the air or stand on the free soil of England,
may be a little questioned, when it is remembered that such property would of necessity be almost worthless in a climate, and that at the very moment when a reluctant judge pronounced these boasted words, her capitalists were rolling in wealth that grew out of the sweat on Negro brows in her American plantations. We have heard of high-bred Southern families in which 1,000 outdoor slaves are never suffered to pollute the pure air of the saloons and chambers that their masters breathe, or tread the rich carpets that their toil is paid for. The custom is undoubtedly refined and agreeable, but we never heard that it boasted to rest on higher grounds than ordinary mortals venture on. At the time of the Declaration of Independence, when the colonies escaped from their long pupilage, and, with new rights and new responsibilities, set out to act an independent part among the nations of the earth, the taint of slavery was upon every one of them. In every one, the soil was tilled by Negro bondmen. The laws regulating the relations between master and slave were, it is true, widely different in the different states. In some, as in Connecticut, the privileges annexed to the condition were so wide and the facility of rising from it so great, that a constitutional euphemism which is nowadays so boldly metaphorical might with every propriety style them
persons held to service or labour.
In others, they were then, as now, a hopelessly degraded class, whose happiness depended entirely on the arbitrary will of their masters. Of course, it is not intended to represent that the various states were equally interested in the institution. Varieties of soil, climate, and social habits had drawn the great mass of this population to what are now known as the Southern States. At the time of the Declaration, no authentic enumeration had been made, but when the first census was taken in 1791, the total number of slaves in what are now known as the Northern States was 40,370, in the Southern, 653,910. At the earlier period of which we are now speaking, the disproportion was probably less striking, but sufficiently great to make the interests of the two sections totally opposite. The difference, however, did not depend merely upon the amount of capital invested. The feeling in the North, both moral and political, was decidedly and in many cases bitterly hostile to slavery. The most short-sighted, therefore, could not fail to foresee the speedy adoption of those measures which ultimately provided for general emancipation. Even in Virginia and Maryland, not then considered as Southern states, ardent advocates were found to plead the cause of liberty, and organized action had more than once been attempted in its behalf. Below the Virginia line, in the Carolinas and Georgia, an abolitionist was as rare a phenomenon then as he would be now. Those states were yet but thinly settled, a great part of their lands unreclaimed, and no prospect of improvement appeared, except in the extensive employment of slave labor, adapted both to the climate and the character of the already established settlers. Such was, briefly, the position of the two parties at the opening of our independent history, and such it was, also, when the Federal Convention met at Philadelphia in 1787 to frame the present Constitution. The question presented itself to this body in a threefold aspect. First, as to the influence which an enslaved race was entitled to exercise in the government. Secondly, as to their further increase by importation. Thirdly, as to how far Congress and the Constitution were bound to provide for the security of this sort of property. The first of these was rightly regarded at the time as by far the most important, not only because of the magnitude of the interests directly involved in its decision, but still more so because of the principles which, though scarcely remembered at present, were undoubtedly the basis of the compromise in which the deliberations of the Convention resulted. A moment's reference to the slave census, referred to above, will show how great was the contrariety of interest involved, and give a tolerably correct idea of the influences by which the various states were governed in discussing the subject. For whatever pleasure it might give us to conceal the humiliating fact, candor will compel us to acknowledge that even in those heroic times of our history, interest seldom gave way to any nobler feeling when a question like this was to be determined. These original claims set up by the South, but abandoned upon the final vote except by South Carolina, Georgia, and Delaware, was that the black population should be as largely represented in Congress as the white. It is impossible to give anything but a very brief outline of the arguments used upon both sides, without venturing to insist upon the obvious absurdity that an enslaved and helpless race were really entitled to representation because of any rights they themselves might have to defend or duties which they might be bound to discharge. The Southern members took the position, not regarded at that time as utterly heterodox, that a state is entitled to be represented, not merely because of its containing so many human beings, but because so many human beings are in reality only the exponent of so much wealth or so much power contributed by such state to the support of the general government. The federal value of the state is in direct proportion to the amount of this power, and what difference could it make whether it emanated, as in the South, from a race called slaves, supported at the direct expense of their masters, who supplied them liberally with all the necessaries of life, or as in the North, from a population occupying precisely the same relative position in the social scale, performing labor of the same description, maintained, though in a somewhat different way, by the same capitalist, and called freemen. If one were entitled to representation, why not the other? The Negro population was as essentially a producing power and as original an element of wealth as any body of free laborers could be, and therefore as fully entitled to have their interests consulted in the proceedings of a government instituted for the express purpose of providing for the security of property. But in addition to this, they were entitled to make this claim not only as producers, but also as consumers of those foreign productions, the importation of which would form one great element of wealth in the eastern states. The fallacy of this reasoning, specious as it might seem, was warmly commented on and exposed by the opposite side. If the Southern slave was to be regarded as any other human being, and as possessed of those inalienable rights which the Declaration of Independence proudly claimed for all humanity, why not at once call him a citizen and give him the right to be represented, not by his master, but by himself? If he was nothing but property, why not speak out openly and attempt to make property the basis of representation, and the government a tool in the hands of a moneyed aristocracy. It was conceded that the slaveholding states were at that time by far the wealthiest part of the Confederacy, but this wealth of slavery was not and could not be an element of power, but rather of weakness and confusion. If it was argued that slaves filled, in the South, the same relative position as free laborers in the North, and their employment necessarily excluded to a great extent the introduction of a population which would otherwise be entitled to representation, then in the same way free and active mind, the only thing that deserves to be represented, was likewise excluded. But on a similar principle, the horses, cattle, and even the machinery of the North, which was nothing but a substitute for so much manual labor, were equally entitled to be heard on the floor of Congress. Why should property in one form go to Congress, and be shut out when it takes another and more human one?
The houses in Philadelphia alone,
said Gouverneur Morris,
are worth all the wretched slaves that cover the rice swamps of South Carolina.
He ridiculed the idea of treating the Southern slave as a consumer.
For the bohea tea used by a Northern freeman will pay more tax than the whole consumption of the miserable slave, which consists of nothing more than his physical subsistence, and the rag which covers his nakedness.
As a last resort, however, the Carolinas had an argument ready which defied all ingenuity, learning, or statesmanship to answer, and which has so often proved potential in after discussions.
North Carolina would never confederate on any terms that did not rate the black population at least at 3/5.
Connecticut generosity immediately interposed to prevent so disastrous a result, and after another fruitless effort to obtain an equality of representation, as some of the members rather metaphorically termed it, for the luckless slaves, the clause as it now stands was adopted by an almost unanimous vote. Thus was established the second great compromise of the Constitution. It is in vain to support it now upon the grounds which its friends originally occupied. Truer views of the real origin and real ends of government have forever exploded amongst us the notion that property can in any way with justice be made an element of representation, and that article in the Constitution stands now solely upon any merit which it may have acquired as a necessary concession to reconcile clashing interests, and it will probably hold its place as long as slavery exists, upon the simple ground so tersely laid down at the close of the discussion that North Carolina would never have confederated without it. The course of the debate had, however, clearly shown that the slavery question was at best nothing but the stalking horse behind which deeper influences moved, that though the battle cried on one side might be the rights of man, and on the other the rights of the master, yet the battle cry in this, as in many other cases, hinted but remotely at the real grounds of the war. The slaveholding states were at that time the richest part of the Union, but their wealth arose exclusively from agriculture, and their interests of course entered in this, and in the exportation of their products. The eastern and middle states, though then comparatively poor, were clearly destined to be the commercial power of the Union, though the extent of that commerce and the enormous wealth of which it has been the source, was then little dreamed of. The Great West was as yet a power unknown, and scarcely foreseen even by the most sagacious statesmen. The object of the South, therefore, was to increase their productive power, to give it as great an influence as possible in the affairs of the country, to leave commerce unfettered, and especially to exempt exports from the payment of duties. That of the North, on the other hand, was to give Congress such large powers in the regulation of commerce as might be employed in the protection of their infant marine against foreign competition, and to diminish the duties on imports. In short, it was merely a question as to which should be the predominating interest, whether the South should be a huge plantation to be drained of its wealth by the merchant princes of the North, or whether the northern city should be nothing but the trading depots of southern nabobs. The representation of slaves, the chief productive element of southern wealth, was selected as the test question, and the powers of both parties were developed to the uttermost in debating it. In the end, the North gained the commercial privileges upon which it had insisted, the South 3/5 of the enormous representation which they demanded, together with the exemption of exports from taxation. The overwhelming power and wealth which the North have since acquired, and which must certainly be in some measure attributed to this early policy, sufficiently proves that they made an excellent
bargain.
As one of their members termed it, the morality of their arrangement we do not propose to discuss, but certainly while that compromise, be it good or bad, remains in the Constitution, the interested work of both parties, it would require the nicest casuistry to determine which of them is entitled to indulge in any special self-glorification in the premises. The second question above stated acquired great additional importance from the mode in which the first had been determined, though minor and more local interests prevailed to alter the arrangement of the contending forces. The whole of the Middle and Eastern states were, of course, both from principle and policy, opposed to the perpetuation of the slave trade. They had everything to lose and nothing to gain by it. If this population must needs be represented on the floor of Congress, certainly their next object was to reduce it to the smallest numbers possible. But in addition to these very obvious interests, Virginia and Maryland had other and private reasons for wishing to abolish a trade which, as their lands were already overloaded by this unhappy race, could be of no possible service to them, while to some extent it must deprive them of the ever-extending southern market, into which their surplus,
annually arising and renewing,
might be profitably disgorged. Virginia philanthropy was therefore earnest to put an end to so nefarious a traffic, and its ruinously debilitating and demoralizing effects were vividly depicted by her talented delegates. South Carolina and Georgia, whose original swamps were yet unredeemed from their primeval worthlessness and desolation, and all whose hopes of future greatness, both political and agricultural, depended on the increase of this very available population, were sadly dismayed at the dismal prospect thus suddenly and unfeelingly opened before them by the desertion of their late allies. In vain they sought to discover, and no wonder the problem puzzled them, why it should be a damning crime to buy prisoners of war on the banks of the Niger, but a very laudable and eminently patriotic course to buy black children and molasses bred for the purpose on the banks of the Potomac. We would not, however, represent that this question was debated by all the Northern members with such exclusively interested views as marked their treatment of the preceding one. Many of them were really alive to the horrors of a trade which the whole civilized world was beginning to look upon with detestation, and they protested vehemently against its toleration under a new and republican government. But South Carolina was by this time thoroughly versed in that omnipotent logic which has tied up so many Gordian knots from that time to this.
Religion and humanity,
said Rutledge,
have nothing to do with the question. Interest alone is the governing principle with nations. The true question at present is whether the southern states shall or shall not be parties to the Union.
South Carolina,
said Coates with Pinckney,
can never receive the plan if it prohibits the slave trade. Georgia,
echoed Baldwin,
will never become a member of the Union if forbidden to import slaves.
Ellsworth, from Connecticut, forthwith took the alarm.
Was afraid of losing 2 states, while such others as might be disposed to stand aloof would fly into a variety of shapes and directions, and most probably into several confederacies, not without bloodshed.
This singular imaginary spectacle of states flying into a variety of shapes, which has rambled through the brains of successive generations till the genius of the last great compromise exalted it into the sublime metaphor of erratic planets rushing madly from their spheres, of course settled the question at once, and the slave trade was tolerated till 1808, under the harmless euphemism of the migration and importation of such persons as any of the then existing states might think proper to admit. Whether the controversial resources of the Convention were by this time exhausted, or whether revolutionary sagacity failed to discover any new danger to the Union in a clause that in more modern times has proved a mine of most combustible perils, or whether, as is most likely, the members saw that the political interests of the 2 great sections were in no way staked upon the decision, certain it is, that when, late in the summer, Mr. Butler suggested the restoration of fugitives from labor as an amendment to the article providing for the delivering up of criminals. The only objection offered was that the two clauses seemed somewhat incongruous. The proposal was withdrawn for the moment and submitted a few days afterwards by the same gentleman and C. Pinckney. It was at once agreed to without debate. It is somewhat singular that so many complaints should have been made of the inadequacy of a provision thus expressly fashioned by the party it was intended to benefit, and which is in reality more stringent than the one which, had it not been for the Northern members, would originally have been adopted. The convention adjourned about the middle of September, and the members betook themselves to their respective homes, most of them to defend in their state conventions the great work which they had completed. It would be a tedious, and is happily an unnecessary task, to trace the Constitution through the many ordeals it had to pass ere a final ratification was obtained. The arguments used both by the friends and opponents of the compromises were the same as those already sketched. Suffice it to say that while the toleration of the slave trade and the apportionment of representatives met with serious opposition in all the Northern states, yet so far as there are any reports of the debates, there does not appear to have been a word said either for or against the clause relating to the restoration of fugitives, except in Virginia and the two Carolinas, where it was enumerated among the victories gained for the South, and spoken of in terms of high approval. Generally, however, it was passed over without the slightest comment. Such, then, were, upon the subject, the materials of controversy bequeathed to posterity by the framers of the Constitution, harmless enough, it would seem, and not easily tortured out of their quiescent state, but in the gradual change of times and parties, and magnified, too, by sectional interests and passions, found amply sufficient for the political wranglers of 3 generations, and gifted with a vitality and obstinacy that survive and change the conflicts of 60 years, neither broken by the blows nor mollified by the compromising caresses of whole hosts of eloquent statesmen. The jubilee that hailed the birth of the new government was scarcely over, ere its friends, in their eagerness to push the advantages already gained, and its enemies, in the hope of retrieving their defeat, found means to rouse into new life the scarce quieted troubles of the convention. The relative importance, however, of the slavery questions was already beginning to change. The provision apportioning representatives and direct taxes was so carefully worded and had been so anxiously debated both in the federal and state conventions that no flaw could be found to hang a doubtful construction on, and little hope could be entertained of overturning that which had been so deliberately and so recently agreed upon as in some measure the cornerstone of the structure upon which all the nation's hopes depended. It was rather the toleration of the slave trade which at this early period stung the consciences or clashed with the interests of a portion of the members. In the first session of the first Congress, when the tariff bill was under discussion, Parker, a delegate from Virginia, first rekindled the wordy war by moving to insert a clause imposing the duty of $10 a head, which was allowed by the Constitution, upon every slave imported. The question seems to have been debated, like its countless progeny, with abundant warmth. Mr. Smith, of South Carolina, informed the House that
no topic had yet been introduced so important to South Carolina and the welfare of the Union.
Jackson, from Georgia, one of the most indefatigable debaters of his day, and a man of very considerable abilities, attacked Virginia with especial bitterness for her interested and hypocritical philanthropy. But perhaps the most remarkable, as it certainly was the most able speech delivered on the subject, was that of Madison in support of the measure. As his opinions are known to have coincided with those of Washington, Jefferson, and Patrick Henry, they may be fairly taken as expanding the sense of revolutionary Virginia on the great interests of slavery.
By expressing,
said he,
a national disapprobation of that trade, it is to be hoped we may destroy it, and so save ourselves from reproaches, and our posterity from the imbecility ever attendant upon a country filled with slaves. This is as much the interest of South Carolina and Georgia as of any other states. Every addition they receive to the number of their slaves tends to weakness, and renders them incapable of self-defense.
In case of hostilities with foreign nations, their slave population will be the means, not of repelling invasion, but of inviting attack. It is the duty of the general government to protect every part of the Union against danger, as well internal as external. Everything, therefore, which tends to increase this danger is a proper subject for the consideration of those charged with the general administration of the government.
Parker finally withdrew his motion, intending, however, to make it the subject of a separate bill. The chief reason assigned for this course was the unwillingness of many of the members to vote for a clause by which they might seem, however indirectly, to sanction the idea that human beings were to be treated like goods and chattels, and to be classed with and legislated upon as such. No member, however, was found disposed to moot the question so late in the session, and it slept quietly till March of the following year, when it presented itself in a new and much more troublesome form. The interests of humanity involved in the abolition of slavery had not been left altogether to the mercy of politicians and political expediency. At a much earlier period, philanthropic and religious organizations had been established with a view to expedite a result so consonant with the aims of humanity and justice. Among these, the Society of Friends had especially distinguished itself, and some of its more active members now resolved to seize the fortunate occasion offered by the establishment of a new and vigorous government to direct, if possible, some of its wholesome energies to the attainment of their great object. The early meetings of Pennsylvania and Delaware accordingly united in a petition praying Congress to abolish the slave trade. The phraseology of the petition was a little ambiguous, making it doubtful whether it really prayed an immediate abolition, or only that Congress should use whatever power they might possess under the Constitution to discourage the hateful traffic. Viewed in the latter light, the prayer was undoubtedly a most proper one, and even if the former be its true construction, the petitioners only shared an error common to some of the first statesmen of the day, that of overestimating the powers of a newly constituted and untried government. But whatever was its true meaning, the petition broke like a thunderbolt over the heads of the irritable congressmen. The debate exceeded in violence anything that had yet been heard. The Quakers who had ventured to appear in the gallery to countenance their unlucky petition were encountered with scoffing and personal abuse. Jackson renewed his former threats. The whole rang with cries of dissolution, falling columns, torn flags, blood-stained battlefields, and all the dread imagery that seems to be stereotyped in some imperishable material was paraded with frightful significancy before the startled audience. On the following day, however, to which the debate had been adjourned, the Friends appeared with a formidable auxiliary indeed. Next to Washington, no man was regarded in those days with more general veneration than the sage and statesman Franklin. As early as 1787, this great and good man had been chosen first president of a
Society for promoting the abolition of slavery, for the relief of free Negroes unlawfully held in bondage, and for improving the condition of the African race.
A society which deserves a special mention here, as one of the latest acts of its useful and honorable career has been to support the defense in the Treason Trials, to a history of which this brief essay is intended as a preface. A petition of the same nature as that of the yearly meetings was presented from the society and signed by Franklin, this being perhaps the last official act of a strangely varied life, in the whole course of which it would be difficult to point out a single step taken unadvisedly, or a word uttered which the speaker would afterwards have wished to retract. After a long recital, the memorial concluded by praying
that Congress would promote mercy and justice towards this distressed race, and step to the very verge of the power vested in them, for discouraging every species of traffic in the persons of our fellow men.
It would be difficult for any but a congressman, looking at this paper now, to find in it the materials for excited debate, or, at any rate, for violent invectives against the impertinence of its framers. It certainly does not arrogate the privilege of judging or even suggesting the course which it behoved Congress to take. With mingled modesty and confidence, it is left to more deliberate councils to determine what may be and what ought to be done. The the petitioners only imploring, for the sake of humanity, religion, and consistency, that all which could be done should be done. If such was the spirit that offered it, that which received it was widely different. The debate of the previous day was renewed with additional violence, policy, interest, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, history, antiquity, justice, religion, and the Bible, were as usual confidently invoked to the support of both sides. The House was divided much in the same way as the Convention had been on the same subject. But the debate is entitled to particular notice, as opening for the first time the constitutional question which for many years agitated both houses, as to how far Congress could be considered as true to its duty in refusing to listen to and to commit any memorial whatever, not flatly absurd and extravagant, no matter how certain might be the fate which in committee it was doomed to meet. The negative was earnestly insisted upon by Madison and Page from Virginia, and the petition was finally committed by a vote of 43 to 11. After a month's deliberation, the committee produced an elaborate report, submitting that Congress had no power to abolish the slave trade till 1808, though they might regulate the manner in which it was conducted, and impose the tax of $10 if they saw fit, that they had no power to emancipate the slaves already held in the various states, nor to interfere with the domestic legislation by which the several state legislatures might see fit to govern or educate this species of property, but that they had the power to prohibit citizens of the United States from supplying foreign countries with slaves, and to forbid foreigners fitting out slave ships in our ports, and finally that they would exercise all the authority they had to promote the views presented by the memorialists. Our limits will not permit us to give even an abstract of the arguments, thinly scattered through 6 days of congressional declamation, upon this memorable report. The speakers readily divided themselves into the 3 parties which have ever since been maintained, whenever a similar question has arisen in either house: the earnest and uncompromising opponents of slavery, its equally zealous defenders, and a third party, which from that day to this has uniformly stood between the two, with temporizing, soothing, and compromising measures, promising peace, but sowing the seeds of future war, quieting the temper, but not satisfying the understanding, sweet to the mouth, but bitter to the belly. Jackson and Smith, after deprecating the question altogether as unconstitutional and uncalled for, finally took bolder ground than any they had yet assumed, insisting on the justice and necessity of their favorite institution, on the happy condition of the Southern slave, as compared with the laborers of Europe and the lower classes of the North, that slavery, sanctioned by the example of every illustrious nation of ancient and modern times, looked for its original to the will of God himself, that this unnecessary measure bade fair to plunge the Union into confusion, that the South was prepared to defend, and would defend their property against every aggression, that if the compromises of the Constitution were not to be respected, the Union, which had been cemented by them, must at once and forever be dissolved. The opposite side was supported mainly by Virginia, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, but the only speech of interest on their side was that of Scott, from the last named state, who labored, with no little ingenuity, to prove that Congress were no wise bound to inactivity by the clause in question, that, as the arbiters of commerce, the framers of naturalization laws, and the punishers of piracy, they could in many ways not only control, but if they saw fit, at once abolish the traffic, in spite of this ambiguous and disgraceful restriction. There was not, and there could not be, anything original in the views of the third party, except perhaps that their most earnest advocate, Baldwin, came from Georgia. This famous debate, the parent of a countless offspring, resulted in a compromise recommended as
the most conciliatory and the best adapted to the present situation of things.
It consisted in carefully striking out of the report every clause to which anybody could frame a serious objection, and entering the rest on the journal without taking any final action on it. The report, as entered, asserted the power of Congress to regulate the slave trade, so far as to secure the humane treatment of the slaves during their passage, to prohibit foreigners from fitting out slave ships in our ports, and our citizens from supplying foreign states with this commodity, but disclaiming all right to interfere further before 1808, or to exercise any authority in the emancipation of slaves already in bondage, or in the amelioration of their condition. No intimation was made as to how they might choose to exercise the powers thus claimed. The influence which this result has had upon all after times singularly confirms a prediction made by Scott in the course of the speech already referred to.
That what was said, and more particularly what was done in Congress at that time, would in some degree form the political character of America on the subject of slavery.
In fact, congressional legislation has never departed from the standard here established. All attempts to make this really a national question have been uniformly employed for the mere purposes of temporary agitation, and have as uniformly ended in a compromise between a doubting majority and a resolute and unflinching minority. A question of much more practical importance at the present day, and on which it would be extremely interesting to know the views expressed by the sages who watched over the infancy of the Republic, must have arisen in the House shortly afterwards. North Carolina had ceded a portion of her enormous but unsettled territory to the general government, on the express condition, however, that Congress should do nothing towards emancipating the slaves already to be found there. No report, however, of the debate upon the bill has been preserved. For some time after this, all agitation of the subject was carefully avoided. Petitions were occasionally received from abolition societies in New York and Pennsylvania, praying Congress to put to some practical use the powers which, by the report entered on the Journal of the House, they had declared themselves possessed of. Some were referred to committees which never reported, others suffered to sleep quietly on the table of the House, and one from Warner Mifflin, a well-known Delaware friend, escaped the obscurity in which its fellows were forgotten, only to be returned to him with an abusive speech from North Carolina, which nobody thought it worth while to answer. But, during the second session of the Second Congress, the highly important act was quietly passed, which from that time till 1850 regulated the return of fugitives from justice and labor. The governor of Virginia, acting under the advice of counsel, had refused to deliver up a fugitive criminal to the executive of Pennsylvania, conceiving that the provision in the Constitution did not sufficiently define the manner in which this duty was to be complied with. The matter had been submitted to President Washington, who made it the subject of a special message to the Senate, whereupon an act providing for the practical enforcement of both constitutional provisions was shortly after proposed and passed. With regard to fugitives from labor, it enacted that the owner, or his agent, might seize such fugitive, take him before a United States judge, or any magistrate of the city, town, or county, where the arrest was made, prove to his satisfaction, by evidence written or oral, that the claim was a just one, and, having obtained his certificate to that effect, carry him back as his slave, without any further proceedings whatever. The bill became a law, with little or no opposition in either house, attracting scarce any public attention either in the North or South. From this time till the year 1807, the history of the subject may be very briefly summed up. Petitions were from time to time received, complaining of the hardships suffered by emancipated Negroes in some of the Southern states, and praying the interference of Congress to mitigate the horrors of the slave trade. They gave birth to the usual amount of declamation, were in some cases referred to committees, in others either rejected, censured, or suffered to sleep on the table. The two parties of Federalists and Democrats, into which the nation was divided, had long before this become distinctly marked. Every question which was broached assumed more and more a political aspect, and as the power of the Federalists hurried to its fall, the tendency grew constantly stronger in both, to make almost any sacrifice or concession to win over Southern votes. Hence the triumphs of the friends of emancipation were pretty evenly balanced by their losses. Slavery was rapidly disappearing from the northern states, and the attempt repeatedly made to introduce it into the territory of Indiana was as often defeated. But on the other hand, South Carolina, after a long interval, again opened her ports to African slavers, had all attempts failed to impose the constitutional tax upon their importation, while the purchase of Louisiana and the organization of Mississippi gave additional strength to the South, though the danger of flooding them with slaves through the open ports of South Carolina was in some measure obviated by a special provision which closed these newly acquired territories against any of the recent arrivals. The long-wished-for time at length arrived when Congress might constitutionally abolish the slave trade, when the third compromise of the Federal Convention was at length to expire, and the most glaring contradiction in our history was to exist for the future only as a recollection of the past, not as a present and pressing disgrace. All parties were alike resolved to seize the happy occasion. Even South Carolina for a while did not venture to disturb the general unanimity, and resigned herself quietly to her fate. But as the course of congressional legislation never yet ran smoothly, so here a singular notion was started in committee by which it was proposed to prohibit the traffic by heavy penalties, and yet at the same time to enrich the national treasury by its proceeds. This extraordinary plan proposed, in short, that all slaves captured in our vessels by the United States cruisers should be forfeited and sold by the United States into perpetual slavery. Yet a plan so preposterous as this, by which the national government was to be deeply implicated in a crime which it was the very object of the law to prevent, was triumphantly carried by the violence of the Southern members through every stage of legislation to the very verge of final passage. Happily for the honor of the country, the North was at last aroused from her lethargy, and by a desperate effort obtained a recommitment of the bill. Even at this latest possible moment, the obnoxious clause was altered into a binding act to service for a term of years in the free states, and the bill came up for final action. What possible objection could be taken to a provision which threw almost the whole burden on the free states? It is hard indeed to discover, but the idea of emancipating an African, no matter under what circumstances, was altogether too much for the equanimity of Southern blood. Their members, as Ellsworth would have expressed it,
immediately flew off into a variety of shapes,
protesting that they would sacrifice their lives rather than submit to it, and that military force should in vain attempt to force it on them. This meaningless declamation was persisted in on the following day upon some minor parts of the bill providing for the transportation of slaves by coasting vessels, requiring manifests certified by proper officers in order to prevent the obvious danger of deception being practiced in this way upon the general government. The most audacious threats were freely uttered. Randolph, the eccentric member from Virginia, took the lead, gave his singular genius for virulent abuse full scope, and at last concluded by hoping that if the bill were signed by the President in its present form, not a single Southern member would be seen on the floor of the next Congress. The bill was nevertheless signed. As it passed, the Southern members came back punctually at the opening of the next session, and have with praiseworthy regularity been drawing their $8 per day from the national treasury from that time to this. With the passage of this great measure, the victories of the abolitionists reached their climax. From 1807 up to 1818 their successes were fairly balanced by their reverses. The great acquisitions of new territory during this period were so many triumphs for the South, and the new free states which came into existence were erected in districts into which the slave system had never ventured. The spirit which had supported the friends of humanity in their labors seemed to be gradually decaying. The representatives of free principles in the Southern states grew yearly less numerous, while an unaccountable apathy was creeping over the once vigorous and energetic societies of the North. Politicians took less and less interest in views which, if openly professed, would rob them of many friends, while candidates for national offices took refuge from such dangerous ground in discreet silence or studied ambiguity. Without spending time, therefore, upon the many less important debates that intervened between this and the year 1819, we may pass at once to the memorable one which in that and the following year threw the whole nation into a state of unparalleled excitement. A few remarks will serve to explain the origin of this new form of the question. In 1787, before the adoption of the Constitution, the old Congress had, by a unanimous vote, passed their famous ordinance for the government of the territories of the United States. Among the fundamental conditions of this compact, as it was called, and which was
forever to remain unalterable,
except by the mutual consent of both the contracting parties, was an article providing for the perpetual exclusion of slavery from this
virgin soil.
The honor of introducing the provision has been since disputed between Virginia and Massachusetts, but be that as it may, its adoption seems to have been a natural effusion from the spirit of freedom which warmed every heart in those days from New Hampshire to Georgia. The subsequent cessions of territory by Georgia and North Carolina, out of which the states of Mississippi and Tennessee were erected, had, however, been guarded by express reservations of the rights of slaveholders, and these reservations were, as we have seen, necessarily respected by Congress. But upon the purchase of Louisiana and Missouri from France in 1803, no such stipulations had been introduced into the treaty, yet while Congress does not seem to have thought itself at liberty to interfere with the already vested rights of slaveholders in those territories, every possible measure was adopted to prevent the further increase of the race by migration or importation from abroad. Louisiana was admitted almost immediately, passing with scarce any transition from her condition as a French colony to that of an independent American state. With regard to her, therefore, it was thought inexpedient to startle these recently acquired and scarce reconciled citizens by legislation which they might misconstrue into arbitrary misgovernment, taking advantage of their helplessness. In 1802, 1816, and 1818, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois had been successively and quietly admitted under the terms of the Ordinance of '87. The country was thus in a state of perfect repose so far as this question was concerned. All early excitement had died away, a new generation had arisen in Congress, and new intellects were roaming about seeking the material for agitation and display. At this juncture Missouri applied for admission to the Union. A large majority of the Northern members at once decided that they would in all future legislation bind themselves irrevocably to the free principles of the Ordinance of '87. Missouri, it was true, had at the time a large number of slaves within her borders, but upon these vested rights, as the South was pleased to call them, the North did not propose to encroach. But they contended that up to the last moment of her territorial existence the paramount authority of Congress over her could not be questioned. The Constitution, in providing that
new states may be admitted into the Union,
must have intended to allow Congress to exercise some discretionary power in the case, and how could such power possibly be exercised if not by imposing conditions upon the high privilege they were bestowing? Was it to be in the power of any community, no matter how barbarous their laws or how monstrous their social habits, to claim admission into a union already the hope and admiration of the world, simply upon showing that they numbered the requisite population and had set up a government which they might choose to call republican? Such a doctrine could never be tolerated in a civilized and Christian society, and never had been acquiesced in heretofore by the general government. Not a single state had yet been admitted, except upon some conditions or restrictions. And if the general principle were once allowed that the power to impose such restrictions existed, could a case be imagined more urgently demanding its exercise? Were Congress to be called upon at this late day to roll back the tide of legislation which, ever since the
immortal Ordinance of '87,
had been flowing on towards the fulfillment of those bright visions of universal freedom and equality in which the fathers of the Revolution had indulged? Could it be that the Southern members, who had uniformly mourned over slavery as the greatest of evils, and had proclaimed again and again that it was a heavy hereditary curse of which their constituents longed to free themselves, could it be that these very statesmen were seeking to extend this curse, to perpetuate this evil, and fasten upon the growing Western institution that Washington, Madison, and Jefferson had denounced as demoralizing and debilitating? On the other side, It was argued that the Ordinance of '87 was never intended by its framers to apply to any other territory than that which was actually in the possession of the United States at the time of its passage, that the established habits of the region which was now to be admitted peremptorily called for the toleration of slavery, that the Constitution did not, and no power could restrain a sovereign state from establishing slavery or any other institution she chose in her midst, that any proviso like this, therefore, pretending to control that sovereignty, was an absurdity, that Congress had no power to legislate except for territories, and by the very act into which this proviso was sought to be introduced, Missouri would cease to be a territory, and claim equal powers with those who now presume to dictate to her, that as well might the South seek to impose slavery upon Michigan and the uninhabited forests bordering on the Great Lakes. As to the inhumanity of extending what was acknowledged to be an evil and a curse, it must be remembered that the narrower the boundaries into which slavery was crowded, the more terrible these evils became, and that it was only by widely diffusing it that a hope could be entertained of ameliorating, and perhaps eradicating them. Of course, the usual hints about dissolution, anarchy, and bloodshed accompanied these arguments. But the question did not confine itself to Congress. The excitement spread rapidly both north and south. The daily press teemed with the proceedings of public meetings, with private remonstrances, and with legislative resolutions. The future condition of an enormous territory, stretching far into the distant west, was supposed to be at stake. No means were spared to rouse the public feeling to the highest possible pitch. Dissolution and civil war, with all their ghastly paraphernalia, were paraded before the people through every possible medium, and when, at last, the session closed, and the question still remained unsettled, there were few hearts firm enough to look with untroubled equanimity upon the rapidly gathering storm. The debate of the following session was still more violent. The widespread popular excitement urged on the representatives of every section to express, in the angriest terms, the feelings of their constituents. The Senate had repeatedly negatived the restricting proviso, as it was called, and the House as often insisted upon inserting it. At this juncture, Maine applied for admission as a separate and independent state, and as no possible objection could be urged against her, a bill for the purpose passed rapidly through the House, and was sent to the Senate. This happy opportunity for forcing the House into a compromise was eagerly seized, and an attempt made to saddle the bill with an extraordinary series of amendments providing for the unconditional admission of Missouri. The opponents of slavery in the Senate, though a minority, were however a most determined one. But in vain they represented the absurdity of calling this a compromise, merely because two utterly incongruous measures were strangely crowded into a wholesale bill, and equally in vain, when a separation of their natural union was denied them, did they, for more than a month of anxious debating, struggle to hang their favourite proviso to this already many-tailed monster. The bill, with its amendments, was sent back to the House, but the representatives had been as busy as their neighbors, and having, by this time, nearly completed a bill of their own on the Missouri claims, the monster of the Senate's creation was, with little ceremony, stripped of all his tails, and sent back again to that august body in his original simplicity. The crisis was now approaching with a vengeance. In vain the bill was tossed back and forward. From house to house the 4th of March was rapidly approaching, and owing to her peculiar relations to Massachusetts, the 4th of March was the last day upon which Maine could hope for an independent existence. Rumors of secession grew louder and louder, as the hope of an adjustment grew hourly fainter. The people were wound up to the highest pitch of excitement. All other objects were forgotten in the one absorbing question that agitated every heart, and on the morning of the 2nd of March, an earthquake might almost have rolled away unheeded, as at the Battle of Thrasymene. All sides began to be seriously alarmed at the possible consequences of their temerity. The majority yielded. As usual, in a few short hours the great Missouri Compromise was passed. The storm died away, the breakers were cleared, the Union was saved, and the newspapers said that everybody was overjoyed at the happy adjustment. Whether the slaves in Missouri joined in the general jubilee and offered up their thanksgivings for the salvation of the country does not distinctly appear, possibly because the slaves of Missouri were not in the habit of expressing their opinions or offering their worship through the convenient medium of the public press. In substance, the compromise admitted the new state without the restricting proviso, and prohibited slavery forever in the rest of the purchased territory north of 3630. For nearly a year, the Union slept in peace, earnestly trying to flatter itself into the conviction that the
distracting question
was at last put to rest, and obstinately oblivious of an ancient law enacted by Providence long before the foundations of the Union or the earth either were laid, and wherein it is provided that of two opposing principles, one must be right and the other wrong, that no compromise between them, however unanimously voted, can, in the nature of things, be permanent, and that in spite of enthusiastic conventions and full-mouthed congresses, said compromises will forever tend to change, to decay, and to self-destruction. The operation of this most impracticable law, as modern politicians would term it, suddenly and most disagreeably startled the Union from its comfortable nap. Missouri, after discovering so cheap a path to celebrity, was not disposed to abandon it without further efforts to distinguish her infant name. It was still necessary for her, ere she could take her place in the happy and united family of American states, to frame for herself a constitution and present it for the approval of Congress. In this she made it the duty of her future legislature to
pass such laws as were necessary to prevent free Negroes and mulattoes from coming to and settling in the state under any pretext whatever.
The constitutionality of this provision, which has since been adopted by several of the southern states, has never been judicially determined. The clause with which it is thought to conflict is that which provides that
the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states.
Now, if residence and the right to be protected in acquiring and transmitting property under the laws be sufficient to constitute citizenship, the free Negro population of every northern state would be entitled to some privileges in the state of Missouri, and, assuredly, when a party is entitled to exercise certain rights within a given territory, it can never be legal to deprive him of those rights by forbidding him to enter it. And even if these qualifications are insufficient to constitute citizenship, a theory which would exclude a large proportion of the white population in some of the southern states, yet in a few of the free states the right of voting is at present added to them, and in these cases, at least, if the clause be not doomed to remain forever a dead letter, it would seem to find its application. On the other hand, it was urged with great force that if the legislature of a state esteem a certain class of population dangerous to its existence, it must be entitled by the first principle of self-preservation, the foundation both of national and individual existence, to exclude them from its midst. The clause in the Constitution cannot mean that every citizen of each state is entitled to become such in every other state. This is notoriously untrue. In some states freehold qualifications are required for voters, in others not. In some there are restraints upon the acquisition of property, which in others do not exist. Where, then, is the line to be drawn between constitutional and unconstitutional differences? Each state may determine the qualifications necessary for its voters. Why may not one of them be a peculiar color? Each state may exclude from its borders the professors of particular occupations, which may be distasteful to it, or which it may fancy to be dangerous. Or why not those who have, at any time, exercised such occupations which would amount to the same thing as the exclusion of an obnoxious race? During a long and troubled session, this intricate question was argued both by Congress and the people, with a violence unknown before. Mr. Clay, for a long time, struggled in vain to close the rapidly widening breach. In vain, his famous Committee of 13 reported a series of compromising resolutions both sides were too far advanced to retract, and the platform was angrily rejected. No question, however insignificant, could be taken up, into which these bitter feelings were not dragged, the business of the nation was wholly suspended, while the contending forces hurled harangues of defiance at each other's heads, which were re-echoed with equal fury from every village in the country. A settlement grew more and more hopeless, and, at last, a formal plan of secession was agreed upon by a minority of the state. The cry of
danger to the Union
has become so hackneyed of late years as to be treated with contempt by rational men of all parties, but if ever it had a serious and alarming meaning, it was at the time we are speaking of. Even President-making and President-greeting failed to drown the dismal foreboding that soon all presidents might be memories of the past. A storm was raised that no one had power to quell.
The spirits had come from the vasty deep,
and no magician was found who could charm them back again. At length, by slow and cautious advances, Mr. Play again approached the troubled circle, increased his committee to 23, representing all the states of the Union, reasoned with them, exhorted them, entreated them, brought all those wondrously conciliatory talents with which he was gifted, to bear personally upon each member he could reach, and after the most laborious and exhausting efforts, exceeded in passing the compromise which, at last, quieted the Missouri question. It consisted substantially in referring the subject to the national judiciary, to whose province it undoubtedly belonged, and to whose solemn decision the North should, from the beginning, have been content to leave it. That it has never been settled by this high authority, and that we are still unable to answer the apparently simple question,
who are citizens of the United States,
is certainly a very singular predicament for a great people to be placed in, but one for which the South are in no way to blame. The violent sectional feeling, however, to which this discussion had given birth, had sunk too deeply into the hearts of the people to be eradicated by any compromise. Its baneful effects have been since witnessed in the manner in which every great national question has been debated. We cannot, of course, fill our pages with references to these really irrelevant matters, nor have we space to follow in all its developments the illiberal policy pursued by Congress with regard to petitions from the North upon this subject. The treatment to which they have been subjected is generally known, and the reasons for and against it too well understood to require rehearsing. During the 15 or 20 years following, the feeling against slavery grew constantly stronger in the northern states, and gradually assumed a more thoroughly organized character. Anti-slavery societies were formed in the latter part of this period. The all-powerful machinery of the press was called in to sustain the movement. Public discussions on the subject attracted general attention, and all possible means were employed, which the leaders of the party could devise, to propagate their views. The provisions of the Fugitive Law of 1793 began to be, for the first time, severely commented upon. The various laws which different states had passed, with a view to its impartial administration, were strictly scrutinized, and the act itself denounced as arbitrary and unconstitutional. The state of Pennsylvania, unwilling that the freedom of Negroes within her borders should be allowed to depend upon the unassisted judgment of magistrates of the lowest jurisdiction, passed an act in 1826 requiring all such cases to be heard before the judges of the county courts. In 1842, this law was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, in the celebrated case of Prigg v. the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. In consequence of this decision, the legislature passed an act which had already been adopted in several of the free states, by which all state magistrates and judges were forbidden to take cognizance of cases of fugitive slaves. The jails of the state were closed against the masters, and the whole subject was left to the jurisdiction of Congress, where it properly belonged. Such was the state of public feeling, when the annexation of Texas and the conquests won from Mexico called upon Congress to legislate for a new and enormous territory. A large portion of the northern members adhered to the platform laid down by them in the struggle of 1819, resolving that nothing should induce them to swerve from the great principle established by the Ordinance of 1787. The extraordinary rapidity with which the gold fever peopled California, and her consequent application for admission into the Union doubled the difficulty, while the toleration of the domestic slave trade in the District of Columbia, the unsettled boundaries of Texas, and the complaints which both parties insisted upon with regard to the old act for the recapture of fugitives, were each in itself sufficient to embarrass the famous Congress of 1850. The men who prepared to meet this swarm of dangers were, probably, superior to any that had ever coped with the question before veterans in the cabinet, and on the floor men who had grown grey in watching the Constitution, who had received it in their childhood from its framers, and who had guarded its safety for nearly half a century with almost superstitious love. To review the famous debate which led to that compromise, which swallowed up all other compromises, on the broad platform of which all parties have learned to stand, though, perhaps, not very harmoniously, and in the universality of which all minor distinctions are forgotten, would be a lengthy, and is, happily, an unnecessary task. No one who will read this paper needs to be reminded of events so recent and so widely interesting that every schoolboy in the land has thoroughly mastered them and is prepared with a long train of reasoning in their support or condemnation. Our only object has been to show their historical connection with the many measures that have indirectly aided in producing them, and that object, it is hoped, has been partially accomplished. The success of this measure time alone can determine. It has lived thus long amid great extremes, both of popular favor and odium. So far as the fugitive slave law is concerned, the severest ordeal through which it has passed, and one in which its practical working has been most fully displayed, is undoubtedly the trial of Hanway, to a brief history of which the attention of the reader is now invited. The Treason Trials. On the 9th of September, the 1851, Mr. Edward Gorsuch, a citizen of Maryland, residing near Baltimore, appeared before Edward D. Ingram-esque, who, as Commissioner for Philadelphia, and asked for warrants under the Act of Congress of the 18th Sept. 1850, for the arrest of 4 of his slaves whom he had heard were secreted somewhere in Lancaster County. Warrants were issued forthwith, directed to H. Klein, a deputy U.S. Marshal, authorizing him to arrest George Hammond, Joshua Hammond, Nelson Ford, and Noah Bewley, persons held to service or labor in the state of Maryland, and bring them before the said commissioner. Mr. Gorsuch then made arrangements with John Agin and Thompson Tully, residents of Philadelphia, and police officers, to assist Klein in making the arrests. They were to meet Mr. Gorsuch and some companions at Penningtonville, a small place on the State Railroad, about 50 miles from Philadelphia. Klein, with the warrants, left Philadelphia on the same day about 2 p.m. for Westchester. Here he hired a conveyance and rode on to Gallagherville. Here he hired another conveyance to take him to Penningtonville. Before he had driven very far, the carriage breaking down, he returned to Gallagherville, procured another, and started again. Owing to this detention, he was prevented from meeting Mr. Gorsuch and his friends at the appointed time. When he reached Penningtonville, about 2 a.m. on the 10th September, they had gone. On entering the tavern, the place of rendezvous, he saw a colored man whom he recognized as Samuel Williams, a resident of Philadelphia. To put him off his guard, Klein asked the landlord some questions about horse thieves. Williams replied that he had seen them, and told Klein he had come too late. Klein then drove on to the Gap. Seeing a person he believed to be Williams following him, he stopped at several taverns along the road to make inquiries about horse thieves. He reached the Gap about 3 a.m., put up the horses, and went to bed. At 4:30 he got up, ate breakfast, and rode to Parksburg, about 45 miles from Philadelphia, on the same railroad. Here he found Agin and Tully asleep in the bar room. He awoke again, called him aside, and inquired for Mr. Gorsuch and his party. He was told they had gone to Sadsbury, a small place on the turnpike, 4 or 5 miles from Parksburg. On going there, he found them, about 9 a.m. on the 10th Sept. Klein told them he had seen Agin and Tully, who had determined to return to Philadelphia, and proposed that the whole party should return to Gallagherville. Mr. Gorsuch, however, determined to go to Parksburg instead, to see again and Tully, and attempt to persuade them not to return. The rest of the party were to go to Gallagherville, while Klein returned to Downingtown to see again and Tully there should Mr. Gorsuch fail to meet them at Parksburg. He left Gallagherville about 11 a.m. and met again and Tully at Downingtown. Again said he had seen Mr. Gorsuch, but refused to go back. He promised, however, to return from Philadelphia in the evening cars. Klein returned to Downingtown, and then met all the party except Mr. Edward Gorsuch, who had remained behind to make the necessary arrangements for procuring a guide to the houses where he had been informed his Negroes were to be found. About 3 p.m. Mr. Edward Gorsuch joined them at Gallagherville, and at 11 p.m. on the night of the 10th Sept they all went in the cars down to Downingtown, where they waited for the evening train from Philadelphia. When it arrived, neither again nor Tully were to be seen. The rest of the party went up to the Gap, which they reached about 1:30 on the morning of the 11th Sept. They then continued their journey on foot towards Christiana. The party then consisted of Klein, Edward Gorsuch, Dickinson Gorsuch, his son, Joshua M. Gorsuch, his nephew Dr. Thomas Pierce, Nicholas T. Hutchings and Nathan Nelson. After they had proceeded about a mile, they met a man who was represented to be a guide. He is said to have been disguised in such a way that none of the party could recognize him, and his name is not mentioned in any of the proceedings. It is probable that he was employed by Mr. Edward. These were given as
leading facts.
The next day's news contained the information that the U.S. Marshal, the U.S. District Attorney, a special commissioner from Washington City, a company of U.S. Marines, and 50 of the Marshal's police had gone to the scene of action from the city. It was also announced to be the intention of the U.S. Marshal to
scour the neighborhood,
and that Judges Gray and Kane of the U.S. courts, before whom the case was afterwards tried, had decided the offense of the rioters to be treason against the U.S. Such statements as these naturally aroused the whole community, and it was not until a few days had developed the exact truth that public excitement began to subside. Believing the published accounts of the transaction to be correct, a number of the citizens of Philadelphia addressed the following letter to the chief executive of the state, who happened then to be in the city, urging upon him prompt action in what they considered an important crisis. To the Governor of Pennsylvania. The undersigned, citizens of Pennsylvania, respectfully represent that citizens of a neighboring state have been cruelly assassinated by a band of armed outlaws, the place not more than 3 hours' journey distant from the seat of government and from the commercial metropolis of the state. That this insurrectionary movement, in one of the most populous parts of the state, has been so far successful as to overawe the local ministers of justice and paralyze the powers of the law. That you memorialists are not aware that
any military force
has been sent to the seat of the insurrection, or that the civil authority has been strengthened by the adoption of any measure suited to the momentous crisis. They, therefore, respectfully request the Chief Executive Magistrate of Pennsylvania to take into consideration the necessity of vindicating the outraged laws and sustaining the dignity of the Commonwealth on this important and melancholy occasion. John Cadwallader, R. Simpson, John Swift, Thomas McGrath, S. R. Carnahan, Samuel Hayes, G. H. Martin, A. L. Ramfort, W. Deal, John W. Forney, Isaac Leach, J.R. The Ingersoll, James Page, Harry Connolly, Frederick McAdams. The governor, who, as far as was in his power, had apprised himself of the facts of the case, and had taken the measures which devolved upon him by reason of his office, replied immediately. He knew the danger of inflaming the public mind upon a subject which was then exciting the whole Union. The law had prescribed the proper officers to act in every emergency, and he knew they were upon the alert, with their police force strengthened for the occasion. Whatever might have been the motive for addressing the governor, the following letter was a full and sufficient answer. Philadelphia, Sept. 14 1851. To Messrs. John Cadwallader, A. L. Runfort Jas. Page C. Ingersoll Isaac Leach, J.R. R. Simpson W. Deal George H. Martin, Samuel Hayes S. R. Carnahan Those. McGrath, John Swift, Frederick McAdams. Gentlemen, your letter, without date, was this afternoon put into my hands by one of the servants of the hotel. The anxiety which you manifested to maintain the laws of the land and the public peace is fully appreciated, and I have great pleasure in informing you that, more than 24 hours before the receipt of your letter, the parties implicated had been, through the vigilance and decision of the local authorities, arrested, and are now in prison, awaiting an inquiry into their imputed guilt. The district attorney and sheriff of Lancaster County, acting in concert with the Attorney General of the state, deserve especial thanks for their prompt and energetic conduct. This was all done early on Saturday morning, and duly reported to me by the local officers. The testimony taken by the U.S. Commissioner, who arrived at a later period on the ground, a printed copy of which has accidentally reached me this afternoon, confirms me in the belief that the state authorities had vindicated the law and, to a large extent, arrested the perpetrators of the crimes. The cruel murder of a citizen of a neighboring state, accompanied by a gross outrage on the laws of the United States, in the resistance of its processes, has been committed, and you may be assured that so soon as the guilty agents are ascertained, they will be punished to its severest penalty by the law of Pennsylvania. I am very proud that the first steps to detect and arrest these offenders have been taken by Pennsylvania officers. Permit me, gentlemen, having thus removed all just cause of anxiety from your minds, respectfully to suggest that the idea of rebellion or
insurrectionary movement
in the county of Lancaster, or anywhere else in this Commonwealth, has no real foundation, and is an offensive imputation on a large body of our fellow citizens. There is no insurrectionary movement in Lancaster County, and there would be no occasion to march a military force there, as you seem to desire, and inflame the public mind by any such strange exaggeration. I do not wish our brethren of the Union to think that, in any part of this state, resistance to the law goes undetected or unpunished, or that there exists such a sentiment as treason to the Union and the Constitution. The alleged murderers of Mr. Gorsuch, whose crime is deep enough without exaggerating it, have been arrested, and will be tried, and they and their abettors be made to answer for what they have done in contravention of the law. But in the meantime, let me invite your cooperation, as citizens of Pennsylvania, not only to see that the law is enforced, but to add to the confidence which we all feel in the judicial tribunals of the land, by abstaining from undue violence of language, and letting the law take its course. Depend upon it, gentlemen, there is in Lancaster County a sense of duty to the laws of the land, manifested in the easy and prompt arrest of these offenders, which will on all occasions show itself in practical obedience. The people of that county are men of peace and good order, and not easily led aside from the path of duty which the Constitution prescribes. They, and every Pennsylvanian, love the Constitution and the Union. They will detect, as they have done in this case, and arrest and punish all who violate the laws of the land. There is no warrant, depend upon it, for representing the men of Lancaster County as traitors, and participants in an
insurrectionary movement.
You do them, unintentionally I have no doubt, great injustice. I am deeply indebted to you for affording me this opportunity of expressing my views. But for your communication I might not have been able to do so. You, and my fellow citizens at large, may be assured of my firm determination, at all hazards, and under all circumstances, to maintain the supremacy of the Constitution, and enforce obedience to the laws alike of the United States and of this Commonwealth. In order that I may be sure that my answer may reach its destination, your letter having but accidentally come to my hands, I have requested Mr. White to put it in the hands of Mr. John Cadwallader, whose signature, I observe, is first. I am, with great respect, your obedient servant, W.M. F. Johnston. The governor, however, had been misinformed, and was wrong in stating that the murderers of Edward Gorsuch had been arrested. Every man who was in Parker's house, including Parker himself, escaped. As was afterwards proven, not one of the guilty parties was secured. So soon as this was ascertained, the following proclamation was issued. Proclamation. In and by the authority of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, I, William F. Johnston, Governor of said Commonwealth, do hereby issue this proclamation. Whereas, it has been represented to me that a flagrant violation of the public peace has occurred in Lancaster County, involving the murder of Edward Gorsuch, and seriously endangering the lives of other persons, and whereas, it has also been represented to me that some of the participants in this outrage are yet at large now, therefore, by virtue of the authority in me vested by the Constitution and laws, I, William F. Johnston, Governor of Pennsylvania, do hereby offer a reward of $1,000 for the arrest and conviction of the person or persons guilty of the murder and violation of the public peace as aforesaid. In testimony whereof, I have hereunto set my hand and affixed the great seal of the state, this 15th day of September, in the year of our Lord 1851. Attest A. L. Russell, Secretary of the Commonwealth. For days after the melancholy tragedy, the vicinity of Christiana was in possession of police officers of different classes and grades. Many of them displayed their vigilance and valor in a way that rendered them ridiculous in the eyes of all, except of those who were the objects of their zeal. Passing by a number of outrages perpetrated, in the name of justice, by men who were clothed with a little authority, and who delighted in terrifying helpless women and in offensive children, we have to speak only of those arrests which were made seriously and in good faith, and to tell, so far as there are any records in existence, how the authorities arrested, by wholesale, men who afterwards were found to have been miles from the scene of action. On the day of the affray it seems that no action was taken at Christiana for the arrest of any parties. All was confusion. The next morning, the 12th of Sept, Klein went before Joseph D. Hannell, Justice of the Peace of Lancaster County, for the Township of Salisbury, and on oath charged Elijah Lewis, Castner Hanway, John Morgan, Henry Sims, Charles Valentine, Lewis Clarkson, Charles Hunter, Lewis Gales, George Williams, Orson Ponsley, Light Stewart, Hezekiah Clemens, George Wells, Walter Harris, Abraham Clinch, Nelson Carter, and Jacob Phillips, with
aiding and abetting in the murder of Edward Gorsuch on the morning of the 11th September, 1851.
And warrants were issued for their arrest. As soon as Lewis and Hanway heard of this, they went over to Christiana and surrendered themselves to the authorities. They and the colored men were carried to Lancaster that night, to wait a further hearing before Alderman J. Franklin Rygart, of the city of Lancaster. The next day, the 13th Sept, the train from Philadelphia brought up the U.S. District Attorney J. W. Ashmead, the U.S. Commissioner E. D. Ingraham, an attorney who had acted as counsel for Mr. Gorsuch before he applied to Mr. Ingraham in Philadelphia, a company of Marines from the Navy Yard at Philadelphia, and a number of the Marshal's police. These, it seems, when reinforced by such volunteers as could be procured from the neighborhood, composed the force by which
the country was to be scoured.
They went from house to house with firearms in their hands, demanding of the people they met whatever best suited their fancies. On the same day at Christiana, the commissioner heard the charges against Joseph Scarlett, W.M. Brown, Ezekiel Thompson, Daniel Clarksbury, and Benjamin Pendergrast, and they, with Isaiah Clarkson and Elijah Clark, were the next day, Sunday, brought to the Moyamensing prison in Philadelphia,
to await their trial at the next term of the Circuit Court upon the charge of having committed treason against the United States.
On the 15th Monday, the commissioner resumed his duties, and heard the charges against Henry Green, W.M. Williams, John Halliday, W.M. Brown, 2nd George Reed, Benjamin Johnson, John Jackson, Thomas Butler, John Clark, Moses Johnson, Jacob Johnson, Emery Elias, Nero Johnson, William Henry Morgan, Aaron Wesley, Daniel Jones, William Jackson, Peter D. Watson and William Chandler. The first 8, in company with Samuel Williams, were on the same day sent to Moyamensing. What became of John Clark does not appear. The records of the prison do not show that he was ever there, and the transcript of the Commissioner's docket does not say he was discharged. On the 18th September, Callista Wilson was lodged in Moyamensing Prison. It does not appear by whom he was committed. On Sunday morning the 14th Sept, the prisoners who had been taken to Lancaster were again brought before Alderman Reigart, but were remanded until Tuesday the 16th. Before the 16th, it was thought advisable by those in authority to change the nature of the charge against the prisoners. They had been arrested as offenders against the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Now they were to be considered as culprits to be punished by the laws of the general government, and were to be accused as traitors. It was probably with a view to prepare for this, that, when they were brought to the appointed place on the 16th, they were again remanded for 1 week, until Tuesday the 23rd of September. It is generally considered that a man is safe from prison walls until it has appeared to a magistrate that there is probable cause for believing he has committed some offence that should be inquired into by a jury of his country. Such was the common law of England, and many believe it to be the common law of this country. The magistrate has the right, in the exercise of a sound discretion, to detain suspected parties a reasonable time, while he hears the charges and decides whether there is necessity for his making a formal commitment. In these extraordinary cases, however, the operation of the law seemed to be inconvenient to those who had its initiatory administration, and the rule was not observed. Before the appointed time, the company in the prison had been increased. On the 18th September, Jacob Moore was arrested on process issued by Squire Pownall. The prisoners were brought up to Lancaster County Courthouse about 10 a.m. and the examination began before Alderman Reigart. Thomas E. Franklin, Esq., John L. Thompson, Esq., District Attorney for the County of Lancaster, John W. Ashreeder, Esq., District Attorney of the United States for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, and R. J. Brent, Esq., Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Maryland, appeared as counsel to sustain the charges against the prisoners. On their behalf appeared the Hon. Thaddeus Stevens, George M. Klein, George Ford, and O. J. Dickey, Esquires. 12 witnesses were examined on the part of the United States, and about the same number on the part of the defense. After 2 days' deliberation, the alderman felt it his
duty to commit Castner, Hanway, Elijah Lewis, John Morgan, Henry Sims, Jacob Moore, Lewis Clarkson, Charles Hunter, Lewis Gales, George Williams, Orson Punsley, George Wells, Nelson Carter, and Jacob Woods into the custody of the Marshal of the U.S. for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania to answer at the next session of the U.S. Circuit Court the charge of having committed treason against the United States and aiding and abetting in the murder of Edward Gorsuch, a worthy citizen of the state of Maryland.
They were accordingly brought down to the Moyamensing prison on the 25th of September. H. Clemens A. Plinch W. Harris J. Phillips L. Stewart and C. Valentine were discharged, having been detained in prison from the 12th to the 25th of September to await their examination. Jacob Woods, the man last mentioned, does not appear to have been arrested. He was towards the close of the examination upon the witness stand, virtually, though not formally, as state's evidence, it appearing that his testimony implicated himself more than anyone else, was probably the cause of his detention as prisoner instead of witness. On Monday, the 29th of September,
in consequence of the determination of the district attorney to send bills to the grand jury indicting for treason those accused of participation in the Christiana riot,
Judge Kane charged that body at length upon the law which should govern them in their inquiries. This course was required of the judge by his duties as a public officer, yet many were surprised that he should have taken as the basis of his charge statements which many persons knew to be purely imaginative. He stated briefly the occurrences at Parker's house on the morning of the 11th September as he had heard them, and that
it was said that the time and manner of these outrages evinced a combined purpose forcibly to resist and make nugatory a constitutional provision, and in confirmation of this, it is added, that for some months past gatherings of people, strangers as well as citizens, have been held from time to time in the vicinity of the place of the recent outbreak, at which exhortations were made and pledges were interchanged to hold the law for the recovery of fugitive slaves as of no validity, and to defy its execution.
Personally, however, the learned judge said he knew nothing of the facts, and had attempted to preserve his mind free and unprejudiced, being one of the members of the tribunal before which the accused might be tried. If the circumstances mentioned had taken place, the judge was correct in saying the highest crime known to the laws of the United States had been committed at Christiana. He cited many authorities, and concluded by stating with what misdemeanors the prisoners could be charged, under the acts of Congress, if the grand jury were of opinion that treason had not been committed. On Friday of the same week, Oct. 13, the grand jury returned true bills charging the following men with treason: White, 2. Hanway E. Lewis J. Scarlett, and James Jackson. Colored: J. Moore G. Reed B. Johnson D. Colesbury A. Hansley W. Brown 2nd H. Green E. Clark J. Holliday W. Williams B. Pendergrast J. Morgan E. Thompson T. Butler C. Wilson J. Jackson W. Brown J. Clarkson H. Sims C. Hunter L. Hales P. Woods L. Clarkson N. Carter W. Parker J. Berry W. Berrien G. Williams. One charging George Wells Colored with the same offense was ignored. On the next day, like bills were returned against S. Williams J. Hammond H. Curtis W. Williams W. Thomas and N. Fard. The bill against Noah Bewley was ignored. On the following Monday, the 6th of October, the U.S. Circuit Court, in which the prisoners were to be tried, held its session. The district attorney moved for a special venire to issue to the marshal to summon 108 jurors, 12 of whom were to be from Lancaster County,
to try the charges against Elijah Lewis and 37 others who had been committed for treason against the United States growing out of the murderous outrage at Christiana.
He announced that he would move for the arraignment of the prisoners on the following Thursday, and that the 4th Monday of November had been fixed for the trials. Judge Grier said that such a motion was strictly proper, and he directed the marshal
summon men of the highest respectability of character, for intelligence, integrity, and conscientiousness in the community, and to inform them that their attendance will be enforced by the court, and that no excuse but sickness would be received for non-attendance.
The arraignment did not take place the next Thursday, for reasons best known to the district attorney. No further public proceedings were had until the trial. In the meantime, the traitors were made as comfortable by the attentions of their friends as the rules of the prison permitted. Though the building was erected at an enormous expense, it is badly ventilated and miserably heated. Yet the rules did not permit any of the prisoners to have fire in their cells, which at that season of the year was absolutely essential to their comfort. Some of them, predisposed to pulmonary complaints, suffered severely on account of this privation. Before the termination of the trial, the court ordered the marshal to provide more suitable quarters for 2 of them, representations having been made by their counsel that this precaution was necessary to preserve their health and probably their lives. On Sunday morning of 9, about 4 o'clock, 2 of the witnesses for the prosecution, who had been detained in the debtor's apartment of the Moyman Singh prison, made their escape by means of the shutters of their cells and their blankets. A white man who was under confinement on another charge went with them. On Tuesday morning, in the district court, the district attorney, after stating the facts, asked for a writ of habeas corpus directed to the keeper of the debtor's apartment, returnable on the following Friday, directing him to bring forth the runaways. On Friday, the keeper asked for more time to make answer, and the following Monday was appointed. On Monday, it appeared by the statements of some of the counsel for the defense that the truant witnesses were more important for the cause of the prisoners than for the prosecution, and they came into court to complain of their escape as prejudicing their clients. The district attorney undertook to controvert this position, and argued that because these witnesses were receiving $1.25 per day from the United States while in confinement, more than they could have earned if at liberty, their escape was not their own act indeed. A strange and novel doctrine. Most men, whatever their complexion, would prefer the light and air of heaven at 50 cents per day to a cell 8 by 12, in a prison notorious for its poor ventilation, at $1.25. This was, however, the only evidence of
assistance from without,
which the U.S. counsel so frequently insinuated, and upon which Mr. Brent, in his official report, rings such doleful changes, charging treachery on the part of some officer within the walls of the prison. The public was therefore informed by one official dignitary that these witnesses were assisted from without. Another tells us assistance came from within. Leaving out of the question the universal preference for the outside of prison walls, there are two circumstances to be considered in relation to this escape, which, when told, the public will be as well able to surmise the truth as any attorneys, whether in or out of office. These fugitives were confined as witnesses, not as defendants upon any charge. Their friends, or the friends of emancipation, had not the same access to them the law gave to the prisoners. Being detained to testify on behalf of the United States, they were under the strict and especial charge of the government officers. Besides, the Moyam Singh prison is notoriously insecure. Scarcely a month passes by that there are no escapes. The iron bars in the windows of each cell are merely let into the mortar, which a prisoner has only to remove with his knife. The bar can then easily be displaced, and if a little management is used to escape the observation of the keepers, a defender need not wait for the verdict of a jury to restore him to liberty. On the investigation of the law relating to the matter, it was found that the keeper of the debtor's apartment was not amenable to the United States District Court. The inquiry was accordingly dropped, informally. On the same morning, at the instance of the district attorney, it was ordered that the bills against the prisoners be certified to the U.S. Circuit Court, and he announced that Castner Hanway would be tried on the following Monday. John Jackson, it was also said, would be tried immediately after Hanway. During the week, the preparations made on both sides were conducted in private, but one or two matters that excited some attention were permitted to make their way into the public prints. The entire private history of the difficulty which required the umbrage of the authorities at Washington would be peculiarly piquant. But we have undertaken only an epitome of such matters as were made public, and would be digressing from the course marked out, were we to go
behind the scenes.
It appears that as soon as the preliminary examinations were concluded, and it was determined to try the offenders upon the charge of treason against the United States, intimation was received from Washington by the authorities in Philadelphia that the administration desired no pains should be spared in conducting the trials with energy, and in a style worthy the occasion. The learned district attorney for the United States obeyed these instructions to the very letter. Counsel were retained to assist him. The country was searched to procure the necessary evidence. Arguments were prepared beforehand, and briefs drawn by skillful hands to be used at the proper time. Before these preliminaries were quite concluded, letters were received from the Attorney General of a neighboring state, which, by their tone, plainly showed that the writer considered himself entitled to the management of the whole matter, and offers, it is said, were made to the authorities here and their colleagues to take the control of such portions of the trials as this professional usurper chose to assign them. No proposition like this could be entertained. The dramatis person had all been assigned their parts, and had studied their speeches. The machinery had been adjusted for a certain number of wheels, and more than these would clog the movement. Answer was made that there were no vacancies to be supplied, but if the Attorney General chose to be present, some alteration might, perhaps, be made in the programme. The chief executive of the state he represented would not permit his officer to be thus rebuffed. Complaint was formally lodged at Washington, the result of which was that the whole management of the case was altered. The then Secretary of State wished to compromise, and when the District Attorney of the United States for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania arrived from Philadelphia, he was told that the affair was unfortunate indeed, but an alteration was unavoidable. The Attorney General must be allowed to have his own way, and those who had expended their time and talents in making the proper preparations of the case were to acknowledge him as their leader. The effect of this misunderstanding was manifest upon the trial, and to it is solely attributable the fact that, professionally speaking, the management of the prosecution in Hanway's case was, in many respects, a complete blunder. Had its original intentions been pursued to completion, the Bar of Philadelphia would not have been surprised by the imbecile efforts that were made from time to time to bolster up the mistakes and omissions constantly resulting from a misapprehension of both the law and the facts of the case on the part of those who had assumed its management. The papers of Saturday, the 22nd of November, announced that the trials would begin on Monday, and added that
such conveniences as the limited room in which the trials are to take place would allow have been prepared, but they are totally inadequate to the occasion, and we shall not be surprised to hear of hundreds being disappointed who would like to hear the evidence and the argument of counsel.
This alone would be a sufficient answer to the absurdity of the statements made by Mr. Brent in his official report in regard to the favors shown by the Marshal to the male and female members of the Anti-Slavery Society, and to free Negroes. These extract is made from
Cummings' Evening Bulletin.
The authority Mr. Brent cites in support of his allegations. It was penned before the commencement of the trial, and may be considered as the testimony of an unbiased witness. If, however, the Governor of Maryland, to whom Mr. Brent's report is made, had taken the trouble to examine the files of the paper in question, he would have found that on the first day of the trial, the reporter says,
long before the hour arrived for the court to meet, the seats were occupied by white men, and not a female made her appearance. We did not see a colored man in the room.
In the account of the second day, he says,
a very few members of the Society of Friends were present, and these few were probably the personal friends of Hanway.
In the report of the third day, no remark is made about persons present. The reporter, however, says
the seating of every person who desires to be present cannot, of course, be accomplished.
On the fourth day, it is said,
the same absence of colored persons is visible.
Throughout the whole trial, no mention is made of colored persons in the courtroom except those brought up from prison to be identified by the witness Klein. The exclusion of
a respectable gentleman from Maryland.
One of the witnesses, mentioned by Mr. B, is not a case of extremity. During the examination of the witnesses who were called to testify to Klein's good character, a gentleman of Philadelphia, a member of the bar, and consequently an officer of the court, who had been subpoenaed, when called to the stand, before he answered the questions asked him, complained to the judges that he had been denied admission to the courtroom. Towards the close of the trial, another member of the bar complained to the court of the same thing. In both cases, the marshal was called to account, and justified the conduct of his deputies by saying the room was too small to admit all who desired to be present. The judge told him to do the best he could, and that all members of the bar must be admitted. The writer of this went away more than a dozen times because it was impossible to get near the door, and saw hundreds do the same thing. He was personally known to every officer of the court, and could have gained admission had there been standing room. Those who wished to hear and see secured their places betimes. If Mr. Brent had read his favorite authority more closely, he would have seen that the reporter remarks jocosely upon the perseverance and patience of those who
secured their seats by 7 o'clock a.m. and waited till 10 for the opening of the court.
Had the
respectable gentleman from Maryland
been out of bed in time, he might have secured a front seat. On Monday, the 24th of November, the trial was commenced at 11 o'clock a.m. in the United States courtroom at Philadelphia. The entire second floor of the building, known as Independence Hall, is leased by the general government for the sittings of the circuit and district courts. The eastern portion, immediately over the room in which Congress held its sessions when independence was declared, is divided into the offices of the clerk and marshal, jury, and witness rooms, etc. The western portion is the courtroom, and is probably one of the most elegantly furnished, for court purposes, in the country. The learned judge of the district court takes great pride in having everything about him conducted in the most polished style, and few courts can boast of more urbane and polite attendance than the circuit and district courts of the United States for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. For all ordinary purposes, for admiralty causes, the hearing of patent cases, and other business usually transacted in these courts, the room is sufficiently large. But on occasions attracting much of public attention, great inconvenience is felt by all whose duties compel them to be in attendance, and during the trial of Castner Hanway, as has just been seen, complaints were loud and frequent. For this occasion the room had been refitted. Gas fixtures of the chastest designs had been erected, in anticipation of evening sessions. Ventilators of the most appropriate patterns had been placed in the ceiling, controlled by cords terminating at the bench of the judges, so that a uniform temperature could be preserved. Nothing was wanting but space to promote the ease and comfort of those who were to figure in the solemn investigation about to take place. Long before the appointed hour, the courtroom was filled with persons anxious to witness the opening ceremonies. Officers were in attendance to see that the spectators were seated, and no more were admitted than the room would contain comfortably. In the lobbies and on the stairway, policemen were stationed to prevent the crowd from rushing up, to allow those to pass who had been called thither by duty, and to preserve order below. For the first 10 days they were retained on duty, their number being diminished by degrees until public curiosity had subsided. At 11 o'clock, Judges Grier and Kane took their seats, and the court was opened by the usual proclamation. The clerk called the names of 116 persons who had been summoned by the marshal to attend as jurors. Among them were some of the oldest and best-known citizens of the eastern part of the state of Pennsylvania, men whose lives were a guarantee that they were above all petty influences and vulgar prejudices, who could safely take the oath prescribed by law for a juror. 8-1 answered to their names. Several of the absent had sent excuses, and 19 of those present were released either absolutely or temporarily on account of sickness or other causes. Preliminary arrangements were made for reporting the proceedings phonographically for the use of the court and the council. Some conversation was had as to the propriety of restraining the publication of the testimony, etc. of the trial in the newspapers, for fear that, upon a second trial, an unprejudiced panel of jurors could not be found. But no order was made by the court, and during the whole trial, the papers of this and the adjoining cities contained full accounts of everything that transpired. The district attorney then gave notice that,
as at present advised, he would in the morning move for the arraignment of Castner Hanway,
and the court adjourned for the day. On Tuesday morning before 10 o'clock, the courtroom was again filled. After a few more excuses of jurors had been heard, the district attorney for the United States moved for the arraignment of the defendant, Castner Hanway. Mr. John M. Reed, one of the counsel who afterwards appeared for the prisoner, made some remarks in regard to the informality in the summoning of the panel of jurors, and cited several. With such a combination it was confidently expected that, as a matter of practice, aside from the issues to be tried, the management of this cause would be a model which the profession would be safe in imitating. After approving the appointment of Mr. Ingraham as Commissioner of the United States, Mr. Ingraham was called and testified to the issuing of the warrants for the arrest of Noah Bealey, Nelson Ford, Joshua Hammond and George Hammond. At this stage of the case Mr. J. L. Reed asked that the witnesses for the prosecution be kept out of the courtroom during the progress of the trial. Mr. Ashmead asked for the same order as regarded the witnesses for the defendant. The court, admitting the propriety of both requests, granted them, and directed the marshal to provide suitable accommodations. There being no objection on the part of the defense, the Rev. Mr. Gorsuch, who had been subpoenaed for the proof of some collateral matter, was allowed to remain. Drafts of Parker's house and the fields around it were presented, and their accuracy proven. Henry H. Klein, the deputy marshal, who had attempted to make the arrests, was next called. It was known that he was the
leading witness
on the part of the prosecution. He had been the leader of the U.S. forces in this contest, had taken an active part in having the neighborhood of Christiana placed under arrest, had declared martial law there, and had been the principal witness at the examinations in Christiana and Lancaster. His testimony was naturally looked for with some interest, as well by those who knew the character of the man, as by those who had then heard of him for the first time. His evidence is contained in 33 printed pages of the report published under the auspices of the court, more than 1/10 of the whole work. It is not our purpose to speak of it at length. We have already spoken of the facts as they occurred. The portion of his testimony bearing most upon the cause was a statement of the interview with Hanway and Lewis at the bars. The jury were informed of the truth of this matter before the trial was concluded by other witnesses. During the examination of Klein, the question of identity of those present at the transaction came up, and the most of those prisoners whom he had called by name were ordered to be brought up to court on the next Saturday morning. It is this which gives Mr. Brent the offence of which he so loudly complains in his printed report p. 5 of the trial to Gov. Wool. He comments on the dress of the Negroes, the manner in which they had combed their hair, the position in the crowded courtroom, and of the conduct of the officers having charge of the prisoners who thus gave them
aid and comfort.
In his zeal, Mr. Brent probably forgets what he must have learned in his instructor's office, that the law presumes every man innocent, and requires that he shall be treated with every possible attention to his personal comfort, while confined in prison awaiting trial upon any charge. He certainly must remember the sumptuous mode of living allowed to Dr. Webster in Boston, to the Knapps when charged with instigating the murder of their uncle, and many other similar cases well known to every tyro in the profession. Besides this presumption of law, the friends of every prisoner must have free access to him until conviction. The jailer is only responsible for his appearance at the proper time, and may permit him any privileges, save liberty, to which he is entitled as a free man. When these Negroes were brought to the prison from Lancaster, they were dressed in their summer clothing. Their wives and children were too poor to come to Philadelphia to attend to their comforts. It is a strange cause of complaint that they found persons humane enough to furnish them with proper garments. A moment's reflection would see the reason why.
Their comforts and their clothes should be, in every respect, alike.
The supply was probably furnished from the same store, at the same time, and for the same purpose. Instead of being a reproach, it is an honor to our city that persons were found who were unwilling to permit these creatures to suffer for the want of those comforts which are not furnished at the public expense, and were Mr. Brent better acquainted with our citizens, he would see the same thing done in many other cases, in which humanity could not be construed into
bullying and bravado.
Of such a government as that of which we are all proud. On the morning on which the prisoners were brought into court, Mr. Reed represented to the court the effect confinement had on Hanway's health, and the court instructed the marshal that when thus suffering, the authorities had
no right, if he can be safely kept otherwise, to keep him in a manner injurious to his health. If the marshal can give this prisoner better lodging, feeling certain he can keep him safely, we have no objection to any indulgence of that nature, and direct the marshal to grant it to him.
After Klein had concluded, Dr. Thomas Pierce was called. His testimony embraces about 13 pages of the paper book. He repeated substantially the evidence of the marshal. Mr. J.O. Gorsuch was next called. His story was clear and consistent throughout. Mr. Dickinson Gorsuch followed him. These two gentlemen, being one a nephew, the other a son of Mr. Edward Gorsuch, were not cross-examined by the defense. Messrs. H. Hutchings and N. Nelson were next called. These witnesses had all accompanied Klein to Parker's house and testified to the occurrences there. The remainder were called to prove what transpired after the attempt to make the arrests had been abandoned, or to other circumstances deemed necessary by the prosecution to make out their case. After Miller and John Knott had been examined, the court adjourned. On Monday morning, after the excuses of several jurymen had been heard, and an order made for the alleviation of the condition of Callista Wilson, one of the prisoners awaiting trial, the cause was resumed by recalling Miller and John Knott. The array of counsel had, on Saturday, neglected to elicit something that had been,
upon consultation,
deemed of importance. The examination was resumed, and continued at length upon minor points, until the court, at the instance of defendant's counsel, stopped the repetition. Alderman Reigart and W.M. Proudfoot, constable of Salisbury Township, testified to the conduct of Hanway and Lewis when bullied by Klein at the house of Frederick Zerker, where they had surrendered themselves to the officers. The object of this was to show that their silence was tantamount to a confession. Alderman Reigart testified to having come down from Lancaster with a posse of 150 men to make arrests. Charles Smith was offered for the purpose of proving that notice of the intended arrest had been given to Hanway and others by Samuel Williams. The evidence was objected to, the question argued at length, and the objection overruled by the court. Smith then testified merely to the fact that Williams had given notice to him, but did not know the same had been given to Hanway. Dr. Kane testified to nearly the same facts, and, in addition to his attendance upon an annual meeting of the Anti-Slavery Society of Pennsylvania in Westchester some time previously. This was the only attempt made to sustain the allegations of the opening speech of the district attorney in regard to combination for the purpose of resisting the fugitive slave law. Two colored men, John Roberts and Samuel Hanson, were next placed upon the stand. Towards the end of Hanson's testimony, a discussion arose upon a point of evidence in which Messrs. Brent and Reed took part. Their remarks were diverted somewhat from the purpose, and Mr. Brent took occasion to explain his position in the case, though, at that time, his position had not been assailed. He asserted his right arose by reason of an invitation from the federal authorities, though, he said, he came by authority of the executive of Maryland. Altogether, his attempt to define his position totally failed, and the public would have understood the matter quite as well if, according to the rule, no answer had been made to the concluding remarks of the defendant's counsel. Jacob Wood testified that Elijah Lewis had called him from his work that morning, telling him that kidnappers were at Parker's house. Mr. D. Gorsuch then identified the coat his father wore on the morning of the attempt to arrest, and to the surprise of everyone, the case of the United States was announced to be concluded. Seldom do there occur like discrepancies between an opening speech and evidence offered to sustain it. Those observers who, relying upon the loose statements of the public journals, really believed treason had been committed, and, without any personal feeling towards the particular defendants, hoped for a conviction, were sadly disappointed. The general public were astonished that so much smoke had arisen from so small a fire, and wondered what could be the reason. While the friends of Hanway and his colleagues, knowing from the first the exact truth, were gratified that the denouement was in precise conformity with what they had foreseen must be the result of this mockery of justice. The court adjourned earlier than usual, both to give counsel an opportunity of consultation and to await the return of Messrs. Cooper and Stevens, who were absent at Washington, where they had gone to be present at the opening of the 32nd Congress. The next morning, Tuesday, Mr. Kyler opened for the defense. After expressing his surprise at the insufficiency of the testimony offered to prove what had been threatened, he commented on the strange and unprecedented array of counsel in the case for the government. He spoke of the fidelity of the state of Pennsylvania to the Constitution, and for himself and colleagues endorsed the eulogistic remarks of the opposite side upon the value of the Union. The defendant, he said, did not come to justify the transactions at Christiana, but to say that
he was in no way a party to those outrages.
He was a native of Delaware, had, at 5 years of age, removed with his father to Chester County, Pa. After living there for several years he had resided in Maryland, and afterwards in one of the western states. About 3 years previous to the trial he had returned to Chester County, and in 1850 married and settled in Lancaster County, near Christiana. Mr. Tyler then mentioned 2 cases of kidnapping which had occurred in Lancaster County, and spoke of the natural feeling in the neighborhood in regard to such outrages. He then detailed the occurrences of the morning of the 11th of September, stated that it would be proved that Hanway had been told there were
kidnappers at Parker's house,
that it was this which carried him there, and that it was owing to his and Louis' exertions that more blood was not shed, and that, by throwing himself between the Negroes and their pursuers, Hanway had saved the life of Dr. Thomas Pierce. He then stated that he would show by
ample proof the notorious bad name of Klein for truth,
and closed his remarks with his view of the law of treason, quoting at length from many acknowledged authorities. Thomas Pennington was then called to testify to the
kidnapping and carrying away of colored persons in the neighborhood of the Gap within the last year.
The testimony was objected to, and a long argument ensued. The court ruled that it was important, as bearing upon the question of intention, and must be admitted. The witness then stated that in January 1851, just after nightfall, 2 men entered his house, presented a pistol at the head of a colored man who lived with him, and threatened to blow his brains out if he resisted. Other men followed, bound the black man, dragged him off, placed him in a carriage in waiting, and hurried him away. Henry Ray, Rachel Chamberlain, and Miller Pennington testified to the same facts. Elijah Lewis was next called to the stand. In the absence of Mr. Ashmead, who it appeared had determined to object to the witness, Mr. Brent made the objections, on the ground that he was interested in the issue of the trial, i.e. if his testimony should procure an acquittal of Hanway, would this not inure to the acquittal of Lewis on the joint indictment against them, as Hanway could not be tried a second time. The objection was overruled by the court, and the witness admitted. He was then carefully examined and cross-examined, and gave an account of the transaction, from the time he was first told that
there were kidnappers at Parker's house,
until he delivered himself into custody. Henry Burt, who lived with Castner Hanway during September 1851, was next called. He testified to Lewis having told Hanway that there were kidnappers at Parker's house. While Hanway was eating his breakfast, he saddled the horse. After the affray he saw Klein, and had some conversation with him. Jacob Whitson testified that Klein, 3 days after the riot, came to his father's house in search of Parker, who he said had shot Edward Gorsuch. When the court sat the next morning, Mr. Lee, considering himself misrepresented by Mr. Tyler, and his remarks the day previous, explained the position he occupied in the case. The subject of counsel seemed to be a painful one to most of the gentlemen engaged on the part of the prosecution, and no opportunity was lost to explain to the public the relative position occupied by each. Mr. Tyler, of course, when he heard that
the gentleman did not occupy the position of a volunteer, withdrew his remarks.
Thompson Lufford was then examined as to the occurrences of the morning. Samuel H. Laughlin as to conversations with Klein. Isaac Rogers, who lived within a few hundred yards of Parker's house, as to the occurrences of the morning, and John C. Dickinson in relation to conversations with Dr. Pierce after the transaction. Dr. Patterson and J. They. Henderson also testified to statements made by Dr. Pierce in relation to the occurrences of the morning. Hon. W. D. Selly, one of the associate judges of the Court of Common Pleas for the City and County of Philadelphia. Francis Jobson, collector of water rents, W.M. D. Frank Daniel Evans, fireproof chest maker, Isaiah G. Stratton, W.M. Stroud, officer in the custom house, Jacob Walker, John Hinkle, Norman Ackley, constable, Anthony Hoover, Aaron B. Fithy and G.O. Hay, Wise, John Mackey, Andrew Redeffer, John McEwen, Thomas Liston, William Hopkins, James Smith, William Nutt, John Manderson, Jacob Glassmeyer, John Dittus, Joseph Parker, Charles H. Roberts testified that they knew Henry H. Klein. They were citizens of Philadelphia, and some of them had been acquainted with him for 12 or 14 years. When asked the question prescribed by law,
what is his general character for truth and veracity?
The answer uniformly was,
It is bad.
or words to that effect. Some, and among these Judge Kelly, when asked,
Would you believe him on his oath?
answered.
That would depend on circumstances.
Some answered positively,
No.
and others so qualified their answers as to show their belief that his testimony should be received cautiously. John Carr, a blacksmith, who lived 4 or 5 miles from Parker's, testified that on the night of the 10th of September, between 8 and 9 o'clock, he followed Harvey Scott, one of the colored men whom Klein swore he saw at Parker's, upstairs to bed, in the garret of his house, and buttoned the door after him the next morning the 11th, and buttoned the same door, called him down, saw him immediately go about his daily employment, and had him employed that day in his shop. John S. Cochran, who also lived with John Carr, testified to substantially the same facts. Lewis Cooper was examined as to the transactions of the morning of the 11th, after the riot. He carried from the ground, in his Dearborn, the wounded Dickinson Gorsuch, and the body of Edward Gorsuch. He testified to some conversations with several witnesses, and that he was one of the neighbors who accompanied the corpse to Maryland. John Houston was called, and testified that about the time of the riot there was a party of men at work on the railroad near Christiana, who were called to work in the morning by bugle, and to some other immaterial matters. Enoch Carl and Joseph M. Thompson, George Mitchell, Levi Wayne Thompson, Andrew Mitchell, Wharton Pennock, Samuel Pennock, John Bernard, Calvin Russell, Isaac Walton, James Coates, Alice P. Irvin G. L. W. Irwin testified that they knew the defendant Hanway, some of them having known him from boyhood. They all represented him as an
orderly, quiet, well-disposed and peaceable citizen.
With this the testimony on the part of the defendant closed. They had proven all they promised: the notoriously bad character of Klein for truth and veracity, the good character of Hanway, the acts of kidnapping, and such other circumstances as repelled the presumption of combination, but most important of all, the fact that Hanway went suddenly to Parker's house, upon information that there were kidnappers around it, to prevent if possible the recurrence of such scenes as had more than once appalled the neighborhood, that when shown the legal authority of the officer, he was going away, and only delayed his departure from the ground to use his exertions in preventing bloodshed. The prosecution, in turn, offered rebutting testimony. Mr. D. L. Ashmead, in his opening remarks, offered to sustain the character of Klein, which, it seems, was thought to have been somewhat damaged by the attack made upon it, to prove, if the attendance of witnesses could be procured, that the seizure from the house of Chamberlain was not a case of kidnapping, that in September 1850 armed bands of Negroes paraded the
street of Lancaster
city in search of slave hunters, that in April 1851 a Mr. Samuel Worthington had been prevented from making arrest of an alleged fugitive from labor in the vicinity of Christiana, to contradict some witnesses who had related conversations with Klein, to prove that Harvey Scott was at Parker's house, by the testimony of Scott himself, to prove that after the riot Klein had acted as a good officer, and that sundry meetings had been held in Lancaster County in favor of the
higher law.
The J. Wood police officer James Buckley, Lieutenant of City Police John Hentz, Samuel Goldie, Peter Seller, and ex-police officer Charles Worrell, innkeeper William McDaniels, tax collector W.M. The Rankin attorney Alderman Brazier, Thomas Dainroot, John S. Heaser, Marshal of Police Jacob Waitman, bartender John Gamble, police officer John Millward, W. Weeks, Andrew Flick, Constable F. O. Adams, attorney C. B. F. O'Neill Do, Aaron Green, James Barber, Constable James Brown, S.R. Innkeeper John H. Moore, police officer Daniel Wayman, Thomas Connell, John Martin, Robert L. Curry, E. J. Charney Clark, D. A. Davis, interpreter D. L. Wilson, carriage driver Jacob Dollard, John McElroy, Clark J. W. Stamroop, Egbert Summerdike, Nathan Lukens, Lafayette Stainroot, Thomas Downing W. D. Haylett D. D. Emerick D. W. Rickfus, James Pigeon, Albert G. Stevens, James Brown Gr. David Vicely W. Bell, Gray, John Sellets, Henry Cornish, Samuel Babb, Thomas Wallace, John C. Lamb, W.M. Ray, innkeeper Joseph A. Nunes, attorney Joseph Abrams, attorney Michael Barr, innkeeper W. W. Hankinson, Charles H. Lex, Thomas E. Connell, Jr. J. L. Thomas, attorney William Connell, gasfitter Joseph S. Brewster, attorney E. The Pettit to W.M. The Layman Do, Dr. Vonda Smith, Alderman White, Charles P. Buckingham, Philip Winnemore J. C. Smith, George Carter J. Who, Lufford, attorney, were called to support Klein's character. Many of them said they had heard his character called in question, but that they would believe him on his oath. William Noble was next called to prove that.
In the month of September 1851, the county of Lancaster, and particularly the neighbourhood of Christiana, was patrolled by armed bodies of Negroes, after a report that slaveholders had come up there for slaves. That these armed bands of Negroes went from house to house in that neighbourhood, searching for the slaveholders, swearing vengeance against them, and expressing a determination to kill them.
The object of this was to sustain the allegation of combination, the gist of the entire case, in the proof of which the prosecution had so signally failed. To this extraordinary offer Mr. Reed, on behalf of the defence, objected on several grounds. The evidence was in chief, and not rebutting testimony. It was the bounden duty of the prosecution, as well by the rules of evidence as in mercy to the defendants, to have offered it before the close of their case. Besides this, the Act of Congress requires that the United States shall furnish, 3 days before a trial for treason, the names of those witnesses whom they intend to examine touching the charges against the prisoner. Mr. J. L. Ashmead and Mr. Brent both replied, asserting that the existence of this testimony was not known to them at the commencement of the trial, and arguing that this was rebutting testimony. They could find no part of the defendant's case which it could be considered as rebutting, except the opening remarks of counsel. Both members of the court decided the evidence offered to be in chief, and sustained the objections of Mr. Reed. Samuel Worthington was next offered, to prove that some time in 1851 he and a party of men went to the neighbourhood of Christiana, in search of a fugitive slave, and stopped at the house of a man by the name of Haynes that.
Immediately the same signals were given at that house as at Parker's.
And to show by this that
the motive which actuated Hanway and others was not of a lawful and legal character, but of a treasonable and criminal kind.
The same objections were made as before to Noble's testimony, and the defence again expressed their disapprobation of giving evidence to rebut lawyers' speeches. The court overruled the offer on the same grounds as had rejected Noble's testimony, and the witness was withdrawn. Sis Cockney was next examined, to contradict Jacob Whitson, who had testified in regard to conversations of Klein. John Bacon testified to a difficulty between Klein and some officers at Christiana. Harvey Scott was called.
To prove that the testimony given by Carr and others, the alibi is not correct, that he was on the ground, and to explain how he got out of the room and proceeded to the scene of action.
After some conversation, the question was asked,
Were you at the battle on the morning of the 11th September last?
Answer: I gave my evidence that I was there once. I was frightened at the time I was taken up, and I said I was there, but I was not. Question: Were you there on the morning of the 11th September last? Answer: I was proved to be there, but I was not there. Question: On the morning of the 11th September last? Answer: No, sir. Klein swore I was there, and at the time I was taken up I told the man I was not there, and they took me to Christiana, and I was frightened, and I didn't know what to say, and I said what they told me. The witness was not cross-examined, but, after a threat to prosecute for perjury, was discharged. The next morning, Dec. 2, an informal conversation took place in regard to the evidence of Scott. In answer to all the imputations of tampering made by the prosecution and others, it is sufficient to say that from the time of his arrest till the examination on the 1st of December, he was confined in the debtor's apartment of the Moyamensing prison, in custody of the U.S. officers, and beyond the reach of any person, except such as went there on behalf of the prosecution. Like all liars, when left to himself and his own reflections, he concluded it was best to tell the whole truth, especially when this exculpated him from the difficulty into which his own folly and weakness had plunged him. It had been proved, beyond a doubt, that Scott was not within 3 miles of Parker's house on the morning of the 11th, and his declarations made that morning to witnesses who were examined proved that he was capable of telling the truth when uninfluenced by fear. As soon as arrested, he was threatened with imprisonment and death, but at first he told a consistent story. Soon the coward's hope induced him to make false statements. Ignorant, and not gifted with the ordinary intelligence belonging to persons of his condition in life, he knew not the nature and obligation of an oath, and swore as he believed would be acceptable to those whom he supposed to have power over his liberty, and perhaps his life. From the time of the preliminary examinations until brought upon the stand, he was in the care and keeping of the agents of the prosecution, and, as appears by the statements made at the time of his examination, he had been visited in his cell, after the testimony for the prosecution had closed, by some of the counsel for the prosecution, and there told the story which they believed he would repeat under oath. They had their manifest reasons for not calling upon him to give evidence in chief, since they did not dare to do so, even in rebuttal, till he had been visited in prison, and the probable nature of his testimony ascertained. It was also said that the day before his examination,
he was conversed with by several Negroes in the marshal's office, who had to be sent away from him.
This may account for his finally telling the truth. It is certain that in such a place no one had an opportunity of quite so full a conversation with him as could have been held in his cell at Moyamensing prison. But the sight of his former comrades was sufficient to compel him to exercise even a small amount of conscience which nature had bestowed upon him. But if it were granted for the sake of argument that
some Negroes
had a conversation with him, by what rule of right or principle of law could they be condemned for entreating the unhappy man not to degrade himself by committing the loathsome crime of perjury? Mr. Brent's pamphlet implies the existence of such a code of morals, but if it exists at all, its influence must be confined to the borders of the state he represented. Dr. Heath was recalled to refute the charges of cowardice, which it was said he had, in conversation, made against Klein and Dickens in Gorsuch, to testify that he saw 2 of his father's slaves at Parker's house. With this the examination of witnesses closed. Nothing was wanting to complete the trial, but the arguments of counsel, the charge of the judge, and the verdict. Those who had attentively watched the test, having established the general rule above stated as the result of the decisions now in force, Mr. Read past an analysis of the facts of the case, showing in the first place how utterly preposterous was the attempt to dignify this miserable riot with the name of insurrection and rebellion, and that looking at it in its true light, Hanway was not and could not have been a participator. The only overt act he committed consisted in giving instant replies to Klein, and the evidence of this was wholly uncorroborated, depending entirely on Klein's credibility.
A man morally and physically